thank Paul for putting on the third program for winter evenings. We had great panels on sugaring and on logging, and tonight current use. He will introduce the panelists. It would be a big help at the end before you go out to the other room and enjoy the refreshments if you would fold up your chairs. And some of you know the drill and know the chairs go that way, which would even be a bigger help. Or at least fold them so people can get through to all the good refreshments. Most of the winter evenings members are here. Christina Martz in the back, Elaine Howell, Michael Saka, I'm Kay Jorgensen.
Ben is away.
Ben's the only one not here but Wolf. So we appreciate all the support you've given us this year. We're always looking for ideas for next year's 6 programs and sometimes interim programs. So we'd be happy to hear from any of you. So without further ado, Paul.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
That's really important. Thank you for coming. This is a topic that could be really dry and boring, and I'm actually very impressed to see this many people here. You either are supporters of the current use program or really opponents of the current use program, and we'll be finding that out soon. I'm Paul Harwood. I'm a consulting forester. I used to be the Orange County forester before David, long back in the 80s. I'm older than I look. And we're going to try to give you all the information that you need to know about current use tonight. David Paganelli is on the end over here. He is the present Orange County forester. I say present because he's only been there almost 30 years now, very close to 30 years. Actually has the longest tenure of an Orange County forester on record. Nobody's been an Orange County forester longer than David, so give him a round of applause. He stuck it out a lot longer than I did. And then we have Rudi. Rudi is a consulting forester and works for Red Start Forestry in Corinth. Lives here in Tunbridge, and he is on the board of listers for the town of Tunbridge.
Rudi who?
Rudi, Daniel Rundell.
Oh, goodness.
Not many people know that name, but Rudi is what everybody knows him by, right?
Pretty much since
Very
I was
close.
13.
Very close. Okay, so we're going to start off with Dave Paganelli talking about some history of the program, how it works, kind of the nuts and bolts of it, and then he'll turn it over to me to talk about the washers and the wing nuts. Oh, and this is really informal, okay? We sometimes conduct these workshops, or I've been to these workshops, where all the questions are held to the last. So you forget your questions by the time it's over. Don't do that here, okay? If you have a question about what David's saying, or me, or Rudi, raise your hand, we'll answer it. Try to keep it on topic, the current use program. Would really love it if we could hold maybe 5 minutes at the end of this thing to have David tell us the latest on Emerald Ash Bore. You've all seen some stuff in the newspapers about that, so if we could hold the Emerald Ash Bore questions until the end, that'd be great. Okay?
All right.
You're off.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
No, that's not on.
It's not on.
How about this one right here?
I can't use that one.
Try it again.
Try it again.
How about now?
Speak right up to it, though.
Okay,
Swallow it.
all right. Well, Paul asked me to start with giving some background on the current use program, and I thought, well, maybe we'll go back a little farther even and give a background on property taxes in Vermont, or property taxes in general. And when Vermont was all farms and forest, when that was what everybody did, we had a current use tax system where land was taxed based on its current use. If it was a farm, it was taxed as a farm. If it was forest, it was taxed as forest. That's how it worked, and it was really fair. And then at some point, people realized that some farms were very productive. Some farms were really good farms, and other farms were hardscrabble farms. And maybe the taxes weren't that much different. And so they decided they needed a new system, and they implemented what's called an ad valorem system, at value, where they would value farms and forest land primarily based on their value in the marketplace. And that was actually a fairer system, and it provided a finer way to assess the value for property taxes, the fair value. And it worked great. And it was still a current use tax system because all the land was either farm or forest, and if somebody wanted to sell land, they sold it as farm or forest to someone else that was a farmer or wanted to use it as a woodlot. So that was a good system, it was a good change. But then we had other changes in society, like the Industrial Revolution, which moved people off the farms, gave them opportunities to do other things besides work on farms or work in the woods. And they moved to the towns, they made some money, and then they came back into the marketplace to try to buy some of the land that is around us. And so you had all of a sudden more people coming into the marketplace, and don't forget we had upgrades in our access system with the interstate highways and paving our local roads so that people could get around more. And a lot of the properties that were really only locally accessible for the first 150 years that we were here now became accessible to people from Boston and New York and from Barrie and White River and all over. You brought a lot of people into the marketplace looking for land to build deer camps and second homes and ski chalets and subdivisions. And they came with money in their pockets. And so the price of land went up. When the price of land went up and you had an ad valorem system where land was taxed based on its value, you had taxes go up. And when taxes went up on agriculture and agricultural and forest land, people started going out of business because of high taxes. Or selling land that they didn't want to sell because the taxes were so high. So in the late 70s, people in Vermont realized that this was a problem and that we were moving our society in the wrong direction with this ad valorem tax system. And they could have changed the tax system back to a current use system, but what they decided to do was create a parallel tax system, a current use tax system that you were eligible for by application. So you made an application to enroll, and if it was agricultural land, you were enrolled. And if it was forest land, well, the state not being state government, but being our elected legislature, representatives of the people of Vermont, decided that if you were going to get current use taxation for forest land, well, you had to do a little something for the state. You had to manage your land according to current accepted forestry standards. And the thinking behind that was, if you did that, you could increase the productive capacity of the land. You could produce more and better products. And by putting those into the marketplace, you would generate economic activity that would pay for the lost revenue from the lower taxes. So the state required that you have a management plan if you wanted to enroll forest land, prepared by a forester, and then the landowner had to follow it. And that's basically the system we have now. So as of recently, I'm not sure these are exactly current numbers, but they're ballpark. Right now, we have about 12,000 parcels of forest land in Vermont enrolled in current use. And that totals about 2 million acres, which is roughly half the forest in Vermont. And so, I mean, I'm sure that I know that a lot of you are in current use and you understand the tax implications of being in the program. But here's an example. I brought a couple handouts, and these will be available to you if you want them. We'll set them out someplace where you can get them. Unfortunately, Paul may not look his age, but I am every bit as old as I look, and I can't see without my glasses. So.
Oh,
All right, so this pamphlet has an example. So the way the current use program works in a nutshell is your land might be worth a lot of money in the marketplace, but for agriculture or forestry, it's worth less. So the state establishes every year what agricultural land and forest land is worth simply for the purpose of growing crops or trees. And for 2018, the value of forest land is $136 an acre. So what that means is your property might be worth $2,000 an acre, but for tax purposes, you pay tax based on $136 an acre if you're enrolled in the current use program. The tax rate in Vermont is different in every town. The common level of appraisal is different in every town. Those affect how much your actual tax bill would be. But just as an example, the tax rate is usually close to 2%. So if your land is valued in current use at $136 per acre, and you pay a 2% tax, and you have 100 acres, your tax bill would be a whopping $272. If it was taxed at fair market value, let's say in this case $1,000 an acre, it would be taxed at $2,000 for the same raw undeveloped forest land. So that's the value of the current use program to people that own forest land. And you could make the same kind of an example for agricultural land. Forest land has a productive capacity. It grows value. Those trees have financial value. And it's really hard to pin down an average number. You know, how much does the average managed forest increase in value per year? I was thinking about that today in preparation for talking with you, and I don't think I have a good answer. I used to say, back in the 80s, I used to say $5 to $10 per acre per year. And then as I became more experienced, I realized that in some situations it might be $50, $60, $70 per acre per year, maybe more. And in other situations, it might be $1 or $2 per acre per year. Well, if your taxes are $20 per acre per year, and your forest is growing at $5 per acre per year, you know, it doesn't take a genius to figure out what you're going to do with that land. If not today, then tomorrow, and if not tomorrow, in 5 years. And so that's what the current use program does, is it allows people that want to keep their land to be able to at least not be forced out by high taxes. So how does it work? If you have 25 acres or more land, and at least 20 of that is productive forest, you're eligible. And you need a management plan prepared by a consulting forester. The forester prepares the plan for you based on what you want from your land and what the forest is like on your land. It has to be a realistic plan based on what's actually growing on your land and what the productive capacity of that land is. And then once that plan comes back to you, you pay for the plan, and the forester presents it to you, you have to review it and approve it. If you don't approve it, then the forester needs to revise it, because it's your plan for your land. And you have to be on board. When you approve it, you sign it. And when you sign the plan, then you send it to the state for the state's review and approval. And the state has foresters on staff that are assigned to each county, and they're called county foresters. That's what I am. And we review the plans that come in for our respective counties. And if we sign it on behalf of the state, now we've got a management plan, which is a 10-year plan for your property that you prepared and you signed, and now the state signs it. Now it's an agreement It's basically a management contract. And your obligation as someone enrolled in current use is simply to follow your own plan, to do what you said you were going to do on your land. That's basically it. Now, there's a lien that's placed on your property when you enroll. And people automatically bridle at the word lien. I do too. I mean, it's not something that you want on your land. Well, what the lien is not, it's not an unrestricted lien. It's not an ownership lien. What it is a lien to collect a tax, or we could call it a penalty. The state hates it when you call it a penalty, but it is a penalty. It's called the land use change tax. So let's say that somebody has a management plan and it calls for no activity. Their forest has just been thinned and it's beautiful and it just needs 10 years to grow. It's just an example. And in 2 years, they need money and they clear cut it. They've violated their plan. The state will come to them and say, you're in violation of your plan and you need to pay the land use change tax. And that lien allows the state to do that. So that's how the state can exact a penalty for violating the contract. Other than that, that lien only kicks in if you subdivide and create a parcel that's too small to be enrolled in current use. So when you enroll in current use, you're agreeing to keep at least the minimum in one parcel. And if you split it in half so you have two, 10 or 12 or 14 acre properties, neither of those is eligible for current use, you pay the land use change tax. But that happens on maybe in Orange County, perhaps one parcel a year out of 2,000 enrolled properties. And usually the reason that it happens is pretty egregious. I mean, it's not something that is invoked lightly. It's important when you do that, and you don't do it unless the state doesn't do it unless we feel that it's egregious. So that's kind of how it works. I don't know if there's anything else I should have mentioned that I didn't think of.
Just that it's the parcel that's enrolled in current use, not the owner. Okay, so you enroll your land in current use and you sell it to me 10 years later. The property's still enrolled in current use as long as I file some documents to say I want to continue in current use. The obligation to pay penalties, change of use tax penalties, resides with the property as long as it stays in current use. So I get lots of questions over the course of a year about things like, well, we're selling our land, so we have to pay the back taxes? And no, you don't have to pay the back taxes. The change of use tax penalty is only due when there's a development of the property. Development has a number of definitions, one of which is subdividing into non-eligible units. One is cutting contrary to the management plan. One is doing something with the property that's not agriculture and forestry, like building another home on the property or building an art studio or a parking lot for the high school that's next door. Those are not agriculture and they're not forestry. Therefore, the eligibility of that acreage needs to come out of current use and the change of use tax penalty is incurred then. But it's the parcel that's enrolled in current use, not the landowner. And I think that's something that's often misunderstood and relative primarily to that concept of paying the back taxes. The other thing is that when the land's enrolled in current use, the town doesn't lose any tax revenue. You were supposed to pay at fair market value $5,000 a year in property taxes, but because you're enrolled in current use, it's $1,000. The town of Tunbridge and Chelsea and whatever town doesn't lose $4,000 because the state makes up the difference. It's called a hold harmless clause. And the legislature appropriates a certain amount of money every year so far to reimburse towns for the hold harmless clause. So it's not like you're pitting neighbor against neighbor. I'm not gonna get in current use because I don't want my neighbor's taxes to go up to compensate for my enrollment. You know, the state makes up the difference. And that's not the same in adjacent states. You know, other states don't do that, yeah.
But it is like back paying the back taxes, because if you put the property into current use 10 years ago and you saved $4,000 a year, don't you have to pay then $4,000 per year?
Nope,
No.
no. You
don't
talk,
pay anything.
you explain the change of use tax penalty.
If you have a 100-acre property and you enrolled it 10 years ago, you have all that tax savings, and now, you know, you're at a point in life where you decide you're going to sell that land to someone else and they can care for it. You sell it, you're in perfect compliance with your management plan. You sell your management plan too, by the way. And it just transfers to a new owner. If they certify that they would like to remain enrolled, they will. If they certify that they'll accept your plan as it is, maybe you've got a couple years left on your 10-year plan, they can have those couple years. That's worth something. And all they have to do is follow your plan or change it. They're welcome to change it.
Okay,
But no
if you
penalty
do
due.
change it, what's what I'm saying, if you do change it, or like, say, 100 acres and you want 10 set off,
Yeah, that's
okay,
different.
and it's 10 years that you've had it,
Yeah.
then you have to pay like back taxes
No.
now?
Well, you'd pay the land use change penalty, land use change tax, but it's assessed as 10% of the value of the acres that you subdivide. So let's say in your example, you said 10 acres.
I'm just trying to make it.
So whatever, you know, whatever Rudi and the other listers determined to be the value of a 10-acre standalone parcel in your town, you'd pay 10% of that value. They say it's worth $80,000, you pay $8,000. They say it's worth 100, you pay 10. That's how that works.
Just for that year.
Just for that year,
So one-
and then the lien is released on that 10 acres. It doesn't exist anymore. It was only there to be able to collect that penalty.
And the amount of penalty you're paying is irrespective of how many years that portion's been enrolled in current use.
Right.
Okay.
You pay 10% of the fair market value of that piece that you take out of current use in year 1 or in year 30. It's 10% of the fair market value at the time you take that chunk out of current use.
You got that one?
I sort of,
That's a really common misunderstanding. Larry,
that's all right.
What's the cost of the program today?
I don't
Cost
know.
of the what?
what's the cost of the reimbursement from the state to the towns?
I think probably it would be in the vicinity of 60 million. And I would ask you, what would be the cost of not having the current use program?
The current cost is about 15 million in, on the side of the municipal tax, and that's reimbursed by the hold harmless payments. And then there's 45 million in foregone education tax. And as David said, that basically, think about what that means for the land that has been protected through that program.
I mean, if you have 100 acres of land and your taxes would be $3,000 without the current use program, and you're paying $300 or $400 now, or whatever the example was. If the current use program went away and your taxes went back to $3,000, you know, think about what that would mean to you personally. 10 years, that's $30,000. 20 years, it's $60,000. And where would that land be and how many pieces would it be in? And that's what the cost of the current, not having the current use program is. Am I done?
You can be. Rudy, why don't you talk a little bit about the lister's perspective of the current use program? Do you all listers hate it, love it, work with it, don't want to work with it? And then I'll talk about the forestry part of it.
Okay. Are people able to hear me okay?
No.
No. Is that different?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'll use it then. So I want to explain up front that the position of a lister in this neck of the woods is an elected position. So I have, as these fellows mentioned, have worked with a forestry company over the years. My training is as a conservation biologist. I find it a little unusual to be in a position as a lister, but feel that it's very much a service position in my community that has allowed me to get to know this community a lot better. In all honesty, there are a lot of pieces to administrating the current use program at this stage of the game. When the maps are prepared by these folks, we receive a certain percentage of those on a yearly basis that we go through and review and try to make sure that we have assessed the values properly and allocated the different land that is enrolled and not enrolled in the program properly as to how we've got it valued on the tax rolls. So there is a good bit of back and forth exchanges as we process that information. And well, what else do I want to say about it?
Tell them,
So the back and forth is with the state, is that what you're saying?
Correct.
With the state.
So-
and with the
And
consultant.
with the
And with
consultant.
the consultant.
So the
Okay.
consultants are providing us maps and forest plans
Right, okay.
that we are reviewing on a regular basis and making sure that matches up with all of our records and the assessments that we have allocated. And then we are communicating that information back and forth. That information is used on the state level in part to determine the equalized education tax rates.
Right.
Because the grand list values for each town are used in computing
Right.
the allocation of the education taxes.
Yeah.
And then that feeds back into the current use values as well.
Yeah.
David mentioned the common level of appraisal, which is used to adjust both your residential tax rate and the current use rates. That common level of appraisal is a lot of statistics that basically look at, that's how tax values are equalized across different towns. So on a yearly basis, we are looking at the previous 3 years of sales in any given town and the ratio of the actual sales themselves on the open market versus what we have it assessed at. And then those values are looked at on a statewide basis, and through a statistical analysis, then we develop an equalized grand list so that everybody's on a level playing field. And then that value is, our values in relation to that is divided to give that common level of appraisal. So currently in Tunbridge, which I'm a lister here in town, our common level of appraisal is 111.06%, which means that our assessed values are probably about 11% over the aggregated fair market value statewide. We're a little bit high on our assessments. So when the education base rate is established, Tunbridge is adjusted downward by that amount. It's divided by that amount. And that is also then fed into how the current use calculations feed into that overall calculation. It's
Complicated.
Well, can you comment a bit on easement and the impact someone who takes out easement on their property in terms of the value of the property? Is it going up? Is it going down? What's the experience in terms of...
in terms of a conservation easement. So Current use has done an enormous amount to protect working lands in this state. There are other ways to do that as well. Town plans try to do it primarily at on a level that comes into play on Act 250 hearings. Another way of doing that is through conservation easements, which differ from current use in that they are permanent. So once a piece of land is conserved, those are permanent easements. The track record overall has not indicated much difference in land that is protected versus land that is not. There are some people that feel that that adds to the value of the land because that is now protected, and there's some people that feel that it detracts from the value of the land because you've now foregone the development value of it. In the big picture, there have been no trends in either direction. So typically, we are looking at other factors, and the easement, permanent conservation easements have not typically played in to a large difference in how we assess land. In terms of taxes, current uses.
And in terms of the market of that land, does that affect the price of the land? Having an easement and not having an easement?
If you want to sell it.
If you want to sell it.
No. Our assessed value is generally indicating there's not a difference.
Right.
Whether that bears out in the market is part of the, I guess you can call it the science of assessment.
So for the conservation easement, do you have to have like a forestry plan like you would for the current use as well?
Now, conservation easements can vary in how they're developed, and they can specify any number of ways of doing it. You can set aside land for development and keep that out of the protected part of the easement. Generally speaking, the primary things in a conservation or easement is that it's not going to be developed, it's not going to be excavated or filled, or there's a lot of different other factors, but it doesn't necessarily require a management plan. So this is something that, to my mind, is really important to bear in mind. And David touched briefly on when money was brought into the market of buying land. And I want to address a common misperception that I often hear in our office, that it's a lot of out-of-staters owning this land. And statewide, it's about 23% of the land enrolled in current use is owned by out-of-state folks. So it's not the perception a lot of people have.
And the definition of out-of-state folks is people with non-Vermont mailing addresses.
Right.
Because some of them just moved in from New Jersey and bought land, but they have a mailing address now in Tunbridge. They're not part of that statistic.
And I think it's really important, the point that you brought up, that enrollment in the program requires a management plan.
Forest land
Right.
enrollment, yeah.
Correct.
Other questions? We must be doing a great job. Or they're waiting. Rudi, you done? Oh, I'm sorry.
What happens if you sell your property, you have a forest management plan, the people that buy it, they don't renew the plan or whatever, then they're liable for this penalty tax?
No.
No,
here's the answer.
they wouldn't be liable if all they did was not renew the plan. So if they did not renew the plan, I mean, the requirements of the program are you have to have a management plan in place, and it has to be a 10-year management plan. So if the 10 years comes and goes, and they get notice, I mean, we don't have to notify them, but as a courtesy, the state will notify landowners that they need to update the plans to remain enrolled. If they choose not to update the plan, they'll just be removed from current use, and they'll revert to ad valorem taxes. They'll go back to fair market value. No penalty, because the penalty is only invoked if they cut contrary to the plan, or if they create parcels that are too small to be enrolled, or they actually literally develop, as Paul said, put a house on the property.
But that obligation stays with the property forever in perpetuity until the program disappears or the change of use tax penalty is paid. So you may get out of current use by election, by neglect, whatever, and go back to fair market value. 5 years later, 35 years later, if the program's still in place, you decide to subdivide it into 10-acre lots or put a house on it. The change of use tax penalty would be due against the owner at that time, which may be 3 owners back from the person who put it in current use.
Occasionally, just before we get there, occasionally what will happen is somebody will enroll land in current use. Maybe it's father and mother enroll the property, and then they pass away and the son takes it over, and the son is he just cannot stand being in this program. He doesn't want to submit a management plan to anybody. He doesn't want to have a forester come out and he has to pay the forester. He doesn't want any of that. So he withdraws the property from current use, and he hates the idea that the lien is in place. He can pay it off. He can go in and he can pay whatever the 10% of the assessed value of the whole property is, and the lien disappears, and then he's completely on his own, and nobody's watching what he's doing. So that's how, I mean, you can do that, and people do it. Not very often, but they do it. So what was your second question?
Or he could wait until, he could just continue with the plan until it ends, and he would have to pay the lien.
Well, he wouldn't have to pay the lien. If he didn't mind the lien being in effect, he wouldn't have to pay it anyway. It could just be there, and it would never kick in unless he developed or unless he cut. This is one of I guess it's a complex program, right? It's a tax program. So there's a lot of details. So one of the things, that's a little bit of a loophole. You know, your management plan is 10 years, so what if I'm at 11 years? I don't have a plan. I don't have to follow any plan. Well, there are minimum forestry standards, which are not as rigorous as your plan, but they're in writing in the manual for the current use program, and you have to follow those in perpetuity until you pay, which they're very minimal. I mean, if you don't abuse your property, you'll never run afoul of them. But if you did abuse your property and someone knew about it and knew you had been out of current use for 10 years, you could have the land use change tax assessed at that time.
Okay, the second question I had was a follow-up, was that you have your forest management plan. How does that, what's the mechanism that makes sure that the plan is being followed?
Okay, well, the way it was originally designed was that the management plans would be prepared. The time frame has changed, but let's say the current system every 10 years. And so you have your forester on the property every 10 years at a minimum to assess the property. Now, that plan is being reviewed by the county forester. So let's say the county forester is supposed to visit your property at least once every 10 years. It's very difficult to do because we have, just in this county, 2,000 properties enrolled. So, you know, do the math on that. It's 200 a year. And we have other things to do too. So it's hard to get to 200 properties a year. So, you know, you can go 10, 15 years. I know of one person who I've never been on their property and they've been in current use since I've been county forester. I'm not going to say who it is, but I know who that is. You might know too. And anyway, if we had any indication that there was a problem, we would visit. And neighbors and deer hunters and hikers and, you know, people that live down the road often, well, they're little birds. They're little birds, and they tell us what we need to know. So I tell people there's no secrets in the state of Vermont. But if there's no problem, we're not really anxious to go look for a problem. That's not our business. So if there is a problem, we'll look for it and we'll deal with it. So, but the way that it's enforced on the ground is you have your management plan. And now we have licensing for foresters. So the forester is required to provide an accurate description of your property in the management plan update. So if you have a fully stocked stand 10 years ago, no activity prescribed, and now you have half of a stand, something happened. And it's right there in writing. You have a certified licensed forester who's testifying to it, basically, with their written management plan, and you'll get a visit.
Isn't the homeowner or the landowner obligated to file a report if you do something on your property for the past year?
Yes, it's called the Forest Management Activity Report. And what it is, this is a little nebulous too. If you cut a cord of firewood, you really don't have to file the form. We recommend that you do, but you don't have to. If you have a commercial timber sale, you have to file the form because you're supposed to pay taxes on that, and part of the form gets copied to the tax department. So that's mandatory. And if you're implementing your forest management plan, then you want to show that. You want to demonstrate it. So if you submit the form and it says you're going to be cutting firewood at 5 to 10 cords a year for the next 10 years, that's what you're going to do to implement your plan. And 10 years go by and you never send in a report, it looks like, it looks just from somebody who hasn't been out there like you haven't done anything. And that might initiate a visit, and it's really a waste of everybody's time because you've been doing exactly what you said you were going to do.
So what year did this get started?
Initial conversation and planning started in 1978. I was on the committee that designed it.
Was that when we saw you in Washington and you came down? Do you remember? You
No.
sent out a letter.
No, I don't remember
You
that.
sent out a letter and we weren't living here then.
Yeah,
And you went to the Department of Agriculture and gave us
yeah.
law.
That was probably 1979.
And that's when we signed.
But the
up.
first year of implementation was 1980.
Oh.
And it was a very marginal enrollment then. People were nervous about what does it mean to have a lien on your property and the state looking in on what you're doing. And so not a lot of people signed up the first few years. It started growing exponentially as the benefits started becoming real tangible in tax dollars. And people realized that the county forester and the governor and all the legislators aren't knocking on your door saying, you didn't cut the right tree, or you should have cut this one. And so it's grown momentum, amazing.
So I would say we're close to 40 years.
I think if you do the math, it's just about 38, right? And interestingly, when the program first started, it was recognized by the legislature that our tax system, our property tax system was broken, as Dave described. And we needed a Band-Aid. So we created the current use program as an interim stopgap property tax measure until the property tax structure could get fixed.
38 years.
38 years later, it still isn't fixed. This program was kind of perceived as being sort of a 10-year program.
Yeah.
And here it is 38 years later, and it's gotten far more complicated and far more expensive and far more detailed. Numbers like 50% of the eligible land in Vermont is enrolled in current use. Tunbridge has the wonderful distinction of having more properties enrolled in current use than any other town in the state. More than Stowe, more than Woodstock, more than Canaan, Vermont. More properties enrolled in Tunbridge than any other town.
Probably due to you.
No credit taken. Well, let me talk, you want to go some more?
No.
Let me talk a little bit about what the forester's involvement is in the current use program. We've talked about eligibility being 25 acres of forest land, or at least 20 of those 25 being in forest condition. The other 5 or 20% can be enrolled in sort of an open land category, not technically forest, but not agricultural corn land or hay land either, just open meadow that's mowed, or a view on the top of the hill that's mowed a little bit. But no more than 20% of a parcel can be enrolled in that category. So a landowner calls me up and says, I'm interested in the current use program, can you come over and talk to me? And the first thing I say is, if I come out and talk to you, it's going to be for a fee, because I'm a private consulting forester, and my survival depends on getting paid. David gets paid by taxpayers, so the first person you need to talk to is the county forester. So David's pretty busy doing those 200 per year inspections, and so he says, I can't get out there for another 6 months, and then the landowner resigns to talk to me. And so I show up on the property and we say, let's take a look at your tax bill. Let's take a look at your the number of acres you have. I try to bring an aerial photo of the property with tax map lines or parcel lines on it already, so that we can get a sense of how much of it relatively is forest land and how much is open land, and what's your total. And sit down and talk to them about the current use program. How does it work? There's a $90 application fee, initial application fee for getting into current use. There's an application that needs to be processed that's a bit onerous and complicated. There's a lag year. There's a September 1 deadline for an application, which if it's processed on time and a management plan is processed and submitted to the county forester for final approval by October 1, that makes the property eligible to be enrolled in the first coming tax year, which is April 1 following. So here it is, 2018 in March. We could sit down and put an application together, and as long as it gets there by September 1, your first benefit from being in the current use program would be April 1 tax year for 2019. So that sort of lag year means that I come out there and I make a forest management plan for your property, you pay me to do that, and you still get a tax bill from the town that year for the full taxes. It's the following year that you get the benefit, and that's kind of a, you know, it's kind of hard to swallow. There's sort of a front loading of your expenses to get into current use. And so I sit down with the landowner and I say, the questions I get asked are, how much am I going to save by being in current use? And the typical questions that you've had tonight about what are the penalties and how long do I have to stay in and what are back taxes and all those things. And so I present my whole conversation to them. Generally takes an hour, sometimes 2 hours, to talk about all the details of the current use program. I get my calculator out and a piece of paper and I start talking about tax savings. Okay, in year 1 you've got the $90 application fee. You're not in the current use program, but you got that. You got a forest management plan that I make for the property or other consultants make for the property. That costs you something. You still get your fair market value tax bill that year, but next year your savings are going to be X. And my expenses and your expenses, the application and the forest management plan, are going to be another number. Typically, a forest management plan and the $90 application fee costs substantially less than your first tax year's savings in current use. If you're in Woodstock, I made a management plan for a person in Woodstock whose tax bill was $10,000 a year. I made a management plan for $600. So the first year he had $600 from me, $90 from the state, and he still had his $10,000 tax bill. But the next year, he had a $1,000 tax bill. He saved $9,000 the very first year. That management plan is good for 10 years. So he was saving $90,000 in that 10-year period that he was enrolled in current use before I had to show up again and make another management plan. The next time I showed up, I said, I'll make the management plan for 1 year's tax savings. He didn't buy it, so I just, but I wanted to say that. You know. But in towns like Corinth or Canaan or Victory, Vermont, where fair market values are still in that $700, $800, $900 per acre, your tax savings are far less than Woodstock, where the fair market values are literally $10,000 an acre, $15,000 an acre. Norwich and Woodstock are those kinds of assessments. So your tax savings are going to depend on what the listers have valued your property for in that town. So every parcel's different depending upon its accessibility. Is it on a class 4 road? Is it on a paved road? Is it on a state highway? So my calculations have to be based upon the fair market value of the property, the tax rates, the number of acres of forest land, the number of acres of agricultural land, and do all the math and say this, with the assumptions of tax rates not changing and fair market values not changing, this is how much you would save per year. And then they can decide whether they want to go through with the enrollment in current use. As I mentioned before, go ahead.
But the state reimburses the town,
Yes.
and we are the state, so at some point, we pay in somehow.
Yeah, but it's metered over all of the tourists that are here in Vermont, spending money in Vermont, and us collecting taxes on that. Second home vacations, rentals, hotels, fees, it taxes on all those things go into the general fund. And the reimbursement to the towns comes out of the general fund. It's not coming out of your income tax alone. It's not coming out of a number of other things. So, yeah, in a very indirect, not a very indirect way, a real way, you're paying for the enrollment in current use and the reimbursement, but it's on an individual basis tiny compared to what your savings are. Now, sometimes the savings, because the town values aren't very high and the property acreage is fairly low, your tax savings aren't an awful lot. And one of the things I get a number of times is I go out to a property and there's a beautiful home on it. It's a $500,000 house, and they've got 100 acres of land. And they listened to part of what I said, saying, in sort of rough numbers, your property tax savings on the land that you've enrolled in current use is around 90%. You save 90% approximately on your property taxes on what's enrolled in current use. Well, they heard that, but they portrayed that against their total tax bill. And in a case of that $500,000 house on 100 acres, 95% of their tax bill is the house and 2 acres, not the land that's enrolled in current use. So the next year I get this phone call from them saying, you said my property taxes were going to go down 90%. It was $12,000 last year and it's $11,000 this year. I said, yeah, but on the land you enrolled in current use, it went down by 90%. But the current use program doesn't affect the value of the land that's not enrolled in current use, and the homestead, 2 acres, and the home itself. So if you put it all into perspective, the savings are substantial for being in current use, but it's not across the board savings because your house and 2 acres aren't a portion of it. So you decide to get in, go ahead.
I heard there's some changes for this year on contiguous lands that are going to be considered if they're agriculture, and the building, if the building's used in an agricultural purpose, are going to be eligible for the...
If you're a farmer, and farmer is defined as 50% of your adjusted gross income from the business of selling agricultural products. If you are a farmer and you're enrolled in current use, your farm buildings are not taxed at all.
What I'm talking about specifically was non-contiguous building on properties that you may have, like in our case, we have a Quonset hut that's on another parcel of land.
Are you a farmer?
Yeah.
So do you own the other land that the Quonset hut sits on?
Yeah.
Then no matter how many acres that is, if it's agricultural land and the building is used for agricultural purposes, that land is eligible for current use, and the building is taxed at $0 value. But only if you're a farmer. Now, if I own the land and the Quonset hut's mine and you use it, the land would be, and with a lease agreement, the land would be eligible, but the building would be taxed at fair market value.
No.
Well, you've been paying tax.
I'm not going to read it, but what you
I
correct me.
don't think that's right. I think if the building is leased to a farmer, then it qualifies. What I have here is a letter that was sent to everybody in current use. So if you're in current use, you got this letter
Yeah,
too.
we got that.
And it says, farm buildings may only be enrolled if they are in active agricultural use by a qualified farmer, or if the landowner has a written 3-year lease with a qualified farmer to use the buildings for active agricultural use.
Enrolled is different than taxed at zero. Rudi? What do you say? It's a complicated program, and no matter how long any of us have been around it, there are questions like that pop up and you say,
Here's the answer.
I'm not sure.
Here's the next sentence. It says, up to $100,000 of value of an enrolled farm product processing facility could also meaning the previous sentence, I think, could also be exempt.
There's your answer. So your building would be exempt anyways because you own it.
Yeah.
If I owned it, the value of the building would be exempt from that tax bill, as I read that, or hear that.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you're using it as part of the farm, I mean, if you're storing old furniture in there, that might be something different, but if it's used as part of the farm.
Could I get reimbursed for all the years?
Nope, no.
No, that isn't gonna happen.
Michael?
This might be for Rudi, but I mean, we've been talking about the forestry side of current use. What about the ag side?
Good question.
I mean, is it much, how does that work? Is it very different?
The agricultural enrollment has been at a much lower level, clearly, than the forestry has since the time the program was founded. Agricultural land is valued at a different rate for the current use, so 340.
Oh, right there.
347 an acre instead of 136 an acre for forest land this current year. So the current use advisory board meets each year to set these rates, and these are the new revised rates. So,
Do they have any sort of management plan?
no, there is not a management plan in the same way that a forestry property is.
Agricultural land that's enrolled in current use need only have an application with the application fee and a map of the property that shows the boundaries of the property and what portions are agricultural use and what portions aren't. Forest land has to have a much more detailed management prescription. And the map for agricultural land doesn't even need to be updated periodically. If you buy or sell portions of your land or add to it in any way, the map needs to be updated for that purpose. But for agricultural land, it doesn't need anything more than a map.
Unless
there's forest land with it.
There's no state agency, let's say like the Agency of Agriculture, that oversees agriculture in current use. They don't want any part of it. And so nobody really oversees it. The only people that oversee it are the people at the tax department, and the county foresters used to, when we're not farmers. We don't know a lot of things about what goes on the farm, but we used to be asked by the tax department to go out and look at something. Is such and such really a working farm? And you could tell that it wasn't, or maybe you couldn't tell, and that was what you reported. But now we don't even do that. We don't do anything. We're the Department of Forests, and we feel like the Agency of Agriculture ought to take that role, and they don't. So there's really no supervision. So it's a lot of, I don't know what portion of that $60 million supports that part of the program, but it's basically, there's nobody watching the store. And the one thing that is going on is that the tax department is mailing out certification letters to everyone who has enrolled agricultural land, asking them to certify that the land is still agricultural land every year. I'm sure you got one. Yeah. And if you send it back saying that it is, you're good. If you don't send it back, so far what they do is they send you another letter and ask you to send that one back. But they're getting to the point where, they realize, there's millions of dollars that they're paying out to people, and some of that is going to people that really don't have agricultural land. And they're trying to nail it down, and they're determined to do that. So they've told us that they're sending out a second letter this year, and they're sending it to 1,000 people. 1,000 people. And the people that don't respond, they're going to remove them from current use.
So for all of you who are farmers in here, make sure you send that certification out, or your tax bill will jump up like crazy next year, with the idea that you can get back in the following year if you agree to follow the rules afterwards. But for that 1 year, you could get stung pretty badly. Ted?
Say if I'm getting close to retirement and my
Come
kids...
on, Ted.
My kids want to take over, and I sell the farm to them. They have to enroll in the program.
They're already enrolled, Ted. You're enrolled.
Right.
So they don't have to.
If it changes hands.
All they got to do is file a new form, a transfer of ownership form. It's called a CU 301, and it transfers the ownership from you and Linda to one of the 2 or 3 or 4 of the kids, whatever it is. And it's the process that needs to take place to literally change hands of the enrolled property to the new enrolled owners. That's all there is to that. And no penalties, no nothing.
On your forest management plan, is it true that the forester can rate the amount of damage that's done in the harvest over a span of, say, 15 years, and he can sort of spread out the physical damage that's done by the whole tree harvest operations? That is really quite considerable if you're looking at it on a yearly basis, but it's not if you prorate it over 15 or 20 years.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay,
the damage done?
Like the grapple skidders.
Yeah.
I mean, when they go up a forest road, I mean, they're much wider, first of all, and they chew the land, especially in a poor time of the year, like mud season or something, and they'll do a tremendous amount of damage. But the reason they can do that, I was told, is that they prorate that damage.
To who?
It minimized.
I mean, what are they? No, there's nothing like that.
No, I mean, really, forest management is about growing trees to their full value. So if you did anything, and that would be an example where you bring big equipment in at the wrong time of the year and you do damage to the soil, well, the roots of the trees are in the soil. So all those trees that you left behind that you wanted to grow and increase in value, you just damaged all their roots. I mean, that's going to result, depending on the species, if it was sugar maple, those trees would develop big hearts, which would reduce their future value. Plus you have a mechanical damage to the stem of the tree. If you bark it up, you've done damage. So it's something that it's bad practice. It's something that you wouldn't do. I mean, you really shouldn't.
So the forest management plan wouldn't allow that to happen.
Well, normally,
it's not the plan. It's the forester.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes it is in the plan. It'll say, this is a wet site, needs to be operated in the wintertime. Something like that. Or it might say, like in Paul's plans, he'll often talk about the type of equipment. He'll say that it should be operated with small equipment. So a small skidder, as opposed to a giant skidder and a feller buncher and all, that whole suite of equipment, which is huge. A feller buncher weighs 65,000 pounds. And it's a tracked vehicle. That's a big piece of equipment to put in on top of tree roots at any time of the year.
But there's no justification for doing it through a process like prorating damage. I mean, it doesn't make it any less damaging to the tree to say, the damage that's done, we're going to justify by saying we're going to measure it at 1/15 of the damage over 15 years. It's damage done is damage done. So the way around that is to make sure that your harvesting operations are done in suitable conditions so that you don't get that damage.
And just to clarify one other point, the last presentation with the Young and Shane Young, you made the concession that you are at the mercy of the logger to implement the plan. And they need to make a living. I mean, the logger needs to make a living. So a lot of times it seems like a forester will mark 14-inch timber. Like you'd never do that on your own land, it doesn't seem to me. But a lot of timber is marked as 14-inch, and you wonder why that is.
I would wonder too.
I would wonder too. And I would say that the forester's not at the mercy of the logger to implement the plan. The forester's responsibility, and now we have a license to certify that we are adhering to certain standards, moral, ethic, and physical and silvicultural standards, says that we're there to act as the agent for the landowner in the process of improving the quality and the health and vigor of the forest. We're not at the mercy of the logger. If the logger thinks that we're going to mark 14-inch trees because the forester and the logger need to make more money, well, that's a pretty unethical practice, and I don't think there's very many foresters doing that.
Right.
There may be some, but I certainly don't think there's very many.
What happens in the thought process is the forester will see your forest, he'll have a vision for how it should be treated, he'll get your okay to do that, and then he'll find the right equipment mix to implement that vision. So it's you have to have the plan, you have to have the idea of how it needs to be treated, and then the forester's job is to find the right equipment to do that. So the feller buncher might be the right piece of equipment depending on what the vision was, but it might not be. And if it's not, then it maybe it's Shane with a tractor or a horse, or maybe it's somebody else with a skidder. And then the job is to find an operator who's careful and skillful. So he has to try, and it's not just about trying, it's about being able to do the job that he's trying to do. So he has to have the skill to do what he's trying to do. So Paul has people he works with, every forester has people they work with, and theoretically they find a person who's matched to your job, whatever your job is. And that's critical. If you don't do that, it's not going to work. It's not going to work out well. That's what foresters do. I mean, that's 3/4 of what foresters do right there.
Okay.
How does the current use program address a landowner who wants to be enrolled in current use but also wants to be able to have his or her children have the ability to build houses on the land later on?
Well, you can build houses on your land. You just have to have the minimum to enroll in the program and maintain the minimum. And if you have an idea that your son or daughter is going to build a house on the property and you know where it's going to be, you just don't enroll that 2 acres.
So it's a 2-acre minimum.
It's a
20
2
acres
acres.
still the minimum?
It's still the minimum. You have to have 25 total acres enrolled, of which at least 20 has to be productive forest land. If you have 100 acres and you know that you have 2 kids and they each want to build a house, and you know where they want to build the houses,
which is the kicker.
Well, yeah, which is not always unknown. You just don't enroll those 2-acre building sites.
And there's a break-even point there where if my kids are 5 and they're not going to theoretically want a home on this property for 15 years, you know, when they're 20. My tax savings by enrolling those pieces of land, that chunk of land into current use for those 15 years is going to be greater than the penalty for taking it out 15 years from now. And so that's something that foresters do to sort of help the landowner decide through sort of math calculations, what's my savings predicted to be for, you tell me how many years it's going to be before your kid wants a house on the property. And if that's 15 years, I can calculate, based on some assumptions of tax rates and things like that, what your savings are going to be, and presuming that the property values go up by 2% per year or 5% per year, we can say, what's the fair market value of those 2 acres 15 years from now? And if the penalty stays the same at 10% of the fair market value, here's what the penalty would be. So I've done the calculations a number of times, and many, many times. And it's about a 10-year break-even point where if land is enrolled, you have two choices, Kate. One is to exclude those chunks that your children might want to build a home on right from the beginning, or enroll that land and pay the penalty when and if your child ever wants to build a home on it. And the break-even point is around 10 years, depending on whether it's Woodstock or Corinth, whereby your savings accrued are going to be greater than your penalty for taking it out. So you have to think about that process. If the children are 16 years old or in college, I say exclude that land right now. Make them pick out where it's going to be and exclude that land right from the beginning, because the penalty is going to be pretty high. If they're 5, I almost always say enroll that land. Half the time, way more than half the times, the kids never want to build on your house, on your land anyways. And so you've paid the fair market value on these 2-acre lots for 16 years, and your kids decide to live in California. So, you know, it's math, and it's calculating what your projected savings are going to be. Felicity, you had a question.
Oh, yeah, it was a question for Rudi, and I probably could figure this out myself. But when we get our tax bill, is it divided up between the house and 2 acres and the land? So that if I look at my tax bill, can I tell how much of my taxes are being paid for the land minus the house and 2 acres? And how much is being paid for the house and 2 acres?
Typically in the upper right-hand portion of your tax bill, there's a section that has the house site value that includes the dwelling in 2 acres.
Sometimes called homestead.
Yeah, just.
Homestead is different.
Oh, it is.
Homestead can include all of the land. The house site value is only the 2 acres and the dwelling. The homestead, if you are a resident.
And then everything else is the land.
Right.
Yeah.
And typically, if you are enrolled in current use, you'll see a line that specifies what the current use exemption is. And so that gets calculated as an exemption that reduces the amount of your grand list value, and then the tax rate is applied to the difference.
Thanks.
Yes.
How big a role when making up a management plan, a 10-year management plan, and surveying the forest, how big a role is your assessment of climate change? We all know that Vermont is going to be getting a lot more rainfall, a lot more intense rainfall in the future. We know that species variety is changing quite a bit in the forest, pretty rapidly, really. We know beaches are under threat right now. How much does that play a role in saying, well, yeah, you could probably, take out this much timber out of your 100 acres. Has it changed a lot? You guys have quite a lot of experience, decades and decades. So just wondering how that...
Decades and decades. Come on. Be careful. At least 40 years, yeah. For each of us. Well, I think it sort of depends a little bit on who the forester is, really. I mean, if you hire a carpenter to build a house, each one of them's going to have a little bit different theory about how insulation should be, and, you know, all sorts of different things. And so each forester is going to come with a different set of tools in his tool bag and understandings about the ecosystems that they're making management plans for. The truth of the matter is that 30 years ago or 40 years ago, when I started working in the forest, we didn't understand or think even anything about climate change. You know, it just wasn't part of our thought process. And neither was invasive plants or invasive insects or a number of other issues. And so it's imperative that we keep up to date with what's going on. But it's a sort of an unknown destiny, climate change is. And so we try to recognize the impacts of climate change, or the potential impacts of climate change, in the prescriptions that we put together in our management plans, knowing that there's nothing definitive about what's going to happen with climate change, but just the realization that it's going to have some effect. And that may manifest itself in keeping forests after harvesting more dense, more diverse, more species diversity, so that if climate change, for example, results in the wiping out of a species, it's not the only species we have in that forest. It's part of a mix. And so, you know, our prescriptions as managers have evolved along with some of the science of climate change. And we're still learning all the time. The researchers are learning, the practitioners learn after the researchers learn, and so we're trying to stay abreast of what's going on, but it's an evolving process.
I see adaptation. A lot of I get plans from all of the foresters in the area, and some specifically address climate change. Not many, but a couple. But I think almost everybody addresses it indirectly. So Paul mentioned species diversity. I mean, everybody is kind of aware now, where it wasn't the case 30 years ago.
Or 20.
Or 20. Everybody is aware that every species has a role in the forest. Everything contributes. If you're going to tinker with the forest by manipulating the vegetation, you need to keep all the pieces, at least in some proportion. So all the species matter. Another thing I see is a lot more mention in the last 5 years about the importance of coarse woody material, large woody material that's left in the forest, either on the ground or standing to be recruited to fall to the ground, because that's where the soil productivity comes from. All that black in the surface of the soil comes from rotted wood, and if we harvested all the wood, then we would break the cycle. So we need to leave some of it, and people are realizing that. And that impacts, that's especially important with climate change, because part of climate change is higher temperatures and therefore more evaporation of water from the soil. So the more organic matter you have in the soil, the more mulch you have protecting the water that's in the soil, therefore making it available to the plants that are there and the trees. And the other thing is the heavy rains that we've been getting. If you have another half an inch or inch of organic matter, you have some buffering to reduce erosion. And speaking of erosion, I mean, we've had these torrential downpours. Everybody's aware of that. All the foresters, all the loggers know that all their trails, their stream crossings are all at risk. So we're seeing bigger culverts installed where culverts are installed. We're seeing more attention to keeping culverts clean so that they don't block up and fail. We're seeing deeper ditches. We're seeing more water bars, bigger water bars, all in response to climate change, even if we don't quite think of it that way, because we all are aware that the weather has changed, even if we don't think of it as climate change. So we're adapting. The profession is adapting, and we talk about all of these things, but they're not always represented clearly in the management plans.
Yes.
My son is also keeping dead and old trees because of the animals, the insects the woodpeckers, the bats, and
Yeah.
so I just thought that was an interesting.
When some of us old guys
Yeah.
and gals
Maybe it's getting
went
older.
to school, no, but when we went to school for forestry, we were trained as timber managers. You know, we looked at ecosystems and forests with the eye toward how do we make these worth more money? So the log that we grew to turn into furniture grew as quickly as possible and as valuable as possible, and timber was the focus. Fortunately, we've evolved, and education to foresters today is a whole different thing. Timber is far, far down the list of importance in terms of what we're trying to focus on. Ecosystems, balance ecosystems, trying to recreate natural systems as much as possible is far more important than the timber tree itself. And I think that's refreshing. And it's been hard for some of the old dinosaurs to pick that up, and some of us are going to retire, so we don't have to. You know, but it's an evolution, just like David said. It's an adaptation of the resource and the concepts of how to manage the resource. And I don't know how much longer we have, but I have a copy of a forest management plan here. If anybody wants to see what, you know, a forest management plan might have in it for details, we're not going to stop quite yet. And then there's a map up here to look to. Yes.
Emerald Ash Bore.
Not yet. Are we almost done?
It's 8:15.
Okay.
You'll be available.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, Emerald
First
Ash.
of all, is there any really burning questions about current use that we want to address before we switch gears into Emerald Ash Bore? Terrific, we did a great job. David?
All right, Emerald Ash Borer is an insect that's native to, oops, sorry. Emerald Ash Borer is an insect that's native to Asia. It was introduced to Michigan in 2000. It was found in Michigan in 2002. They think it had been there for some years, probably 3 to 5 years before they found it. Michigan has a forest that is 20-30% ash, as opposed to our forest, which is maybe 5 to 8% ash. So it spread pretty quickly. And by the time they figured out what this beautiful little green insect was, it was loose, and it wasn't going to be controlled. They started by finding infestations. They would cut all the trees down. They'd go out a little bit, cut all of the ash trees down there, and then they would find ash infested behind them and around them and 10 miles away. And they did it for a while, and they couldn't stop it. It was out. It was out of the box. And it's a small insect. It's about 1/4 of an inch long. And it's really thin, and it's bright green. If you see pictures of it, it's bright green. But if you see one of the insects, you might not even notice it, because it's so small and so thin that the green doesn't stand up. It stands up in the photographs because they want you to see it. But in nature, you might not even notice that it was a green insect. And you might not even notice it because it's so small. And it spends most of its time under the bark of the tree and in the top of the tree. And it infests all ash trees and no other trees, as far as we know. Just ash, but all ash. And it's 100% deadly. So we're not likely to have any survivors. They say things like, it only infests trees 1 inch in diameter and larger. Well, okay, but you know, they don't have rulers, and if they'll kill something that's slightly over an inch, I'll bet if they were hungry enough, they'd kill something slightly under an inch. So we'll see. They generally take 2 to 3 years to start killing trees once they're in a place. So if there was a population here in town, it could be here for 2 or 3 years before anybody noticed it.
Do you see
And,
holes or something, or there's any way you can look at a tree and see if it has it?
well, you can. There are a number of symptoms, but, you know, I mean, trees get sick and die and have symptoms of poor health everywhere. So it's hard to know that that ash tree that's unhealthy looking is infested by emerald ash borer as opposed to something else. What you tend to see is dead branches in the top of the tree. You tend to see woodpecker activity. So you may hear woodpeckers, you may see woodpeckers. If you see woodpeckers on ash, you wonder. And if it was a small enough tree and you were able to cut it down, you might cut it down if you were that curious. You'll see something that's called blonding, which is where the bark of the ash gets knocked off in a patch that might be 2 or 3 times as big as the palm of your hand. And that's from the woodpeckers exploring, looking for the insects under the bark. And they're chopping away at the bark, and they'll knock enough of a piece off that it'll be a tan section on otherwise gray bark. So that's called blonding.
Are they feeding on the cambium layer, or is that what they?
Yeah, they're feeding on the cambium layer below the bark. And if you peeled the bark off, you would see their galleries, and they're serpentine, so they're like a snake or a winding river. They're not like vertical or long. They're like this, and they're everywhere when you see them. And they focus on the tops of the trees first, and by the time they get to the bottom of the tree, it's been a while. And I've seen infested areas in Michigan. I went to a place that was in a wetland, and the trees were probably 8 inches in diameter. They were wetland trees. They weren't that healthy to start with, and a lot of them were dead, and a lot of them had dead branches in their tops. They were obviously unhealthy, but it was a wetland too, so high water table could do the same thing. And they told us that these were infested trees, and they turned about 30 foresters loose, and I'll bet it took us 5 minutes to find a hole. They're not easy to see, because the insects are really small, and the holes they make are really small. If you took the tip of this pen and you stuck it into the hole, it would probably go in as far as the black. I don't know if you can all see the black. It won't go in very far because the hole is small, and it's a half circle, which is very distinctive. It's not a full circle, it's a half circle, a perfect half circle, like a capital D blacked out. So that's distinctive, but they're small. And in the roughness of the bark, sometimes they're distorted, and you can't really, you look at it and you say, that looks like a D, but this one looks kind of round. And you chip off the bark, and maybe you'll find one that it's a perfect D, and you see it, and then there's not much doubt, especially if it's got the galleries. Epicormic branching, the sprouts that come out of a tree that aren't the normal branching pattern, that comes out of a stressed tree. Usually you see that lower in the crown.
So Dave, now that it's been discovered in Vermont, what's your prediction of how that's going to impact markets and quarantines and county quarantines versus statewide quarantines? Or
it would be easy to overestimate the immediate impact. It's probably been here 3 or 4 years because there was some mortality. They found mortality, so that means it's been here 3 or 4 years. They found it at least 2 sites nearby, maybe a half a mile apart. There's probably more, but we haven't figured it out yet. It's hard to get to that place and look. The infestation area is right near the junction of Caledonia County, Washington County, and Orange County. I mean, it's like within a mile or 2 of the county lines. So it's a reasonable expectation that we might find infestations in each county or close enough to the county that they might have a minimum of a 3-county quarantine. None of that's been decided yet. They might have a 1-county quarantine. They might have a statewide quarantine. They want to find out first what we're dealing with, and then 2, figure out what's best. You know, a localized quarantine is difficult if you want to move wood. A lot of our markets are in unquarantined areas, and to travel from one to the other is a problem. And we have time restrictions on when you can move infested wood, and it's going to be difficult. But as far as its impact on markets nationwide, where this is the 32nd infested state, it hasn't impacted the markets dramatically. It's a worldwide market. So the fact that we've got it here in Vermont doesn't change the worldwide demand for white ash.
I think it was this morning or yesterday, I heard on the news that they're putting a ban on moving wood out of the state. I think it was on the radio this morning or yesterday.
I haven't heard that.
Talking about this ash borer.
Well, there's been a firewood ban.
Maybe that's
Yeah, because they think that really, the insect, again, is so small, and it has the potential to fly up to 2 miles in 1 year. So the reason I say that is that the natural rate of spread of the insect would be, maximum 2 miles in a year.
How do they know that anyway?
Yeah, I don't know how they know that. But the way it usually spreads is not by natural spread. I mean, of course it does by natural spread, but the really impactful way that it spreads is by being in the back of somebody's pickup truck in a piece of ash firewood that goes 150 miles in 2.5 hours. That's how it spreads. And so we've had restrictions on moving firewood that really haven't been actively enforced because we don't have a special police force assigned to firewood. But we've been asking people to be really careful about moving firewood for years, and most people are aware of that and don't move their firewood long distances and don't buy firewood naturally from 50, 60 miles away in another state. That's not something we would do anyway, but generally we've been asking people not to do it. At the campgrounds, people often bring firewood to the campgrounds, so the state parks have been asking people if they have any firewood. If they do, they take the firewood away, and then they give them fire. Well, they replace it. So they take it, they put it in a safe place, they burn it up, and they give people safe firewood. So we've been trying to do these things for years, and it's probably why we haven't had a problem until now.
Dave, have these been those purple things that you see in the tube, is this the testings?
Yeah, the purple traps that have been around are pheromone traps. And I remember being at a meeting where they said they had, like a dozen different traps to pick from. I shouldn't tell you this because it's embarrassing. I mean, I'll tell you. They said at this meeting that they had like a dozen different types of pheromone traps. And some were reasonably effective and some were not effective at all. The purple traps were, if not the least effective, they were almost the least effective, but they were cheap.
And not the purchasing department's criteria.
So they didn't find the Emerald Ash Bore. They may find other infestations, but they haven't yet. It was a forester working on our current use property. He found an ash tree that he was suspicious of. He peeled the bark off, took a photo, sent it in, and our people saw it and said, this is something we need to look at today. And they did. And it was confirmed on Tuesday at noontime, and it hit the papers and the TV stations at 5 o'clock.
Michael.
So is it, this has been around for a few years. When was it first discovered?
It was first discovered in North America in Michigan in 2002.
So has there been any research, any kind of headway on any research to try to control it?
There are certain wasps that feed on the Emerald Ash Bore, but it's hard to, we're doing this on the fly. So you imagine how many ash trees there are in Michigan and all the other states that are infested, all the way out to Colorado's got infestations of emerald ash borer. So all the while this thing is spreading on its own and the population is going into the billions and billions of these insects, we're researching that. And we have found some parasitic wasps, and I guess there are a couple other biological controls that I'm not quite sure of, but you can't just like bring that in from China, because who knows what else it will parasitize. So you want it to be native, you want to be sure it's not going to have any effect, any negative effect besides killing emerald ash borer. And all the while you're doing that, these insects are spreading, a mile or two a year or 65 miles an hour.
Do you think you could listen to for boring? I mean, it must make quite a lot of noise.
Well, that's an excellent thought. I've never heard anybody talk about it, but I don't know why not. I'll bet you could.
They're pretty tiny.
They're small.
They're really tiny.
But there's a lot of them. And those galleries are pretty comprehensive, and there's some wood chewing going on, so I wouldn't be surprised, yeah. That's an interesting thought. I'll bring that up to people that might have some.
Well, I know we could talk about emerald ash borer and current use for a lot longer. I think our time is about up. Stay tuned, watch the news about emerald ash borer. There'll be public meetings, there'll be all sorts of information available about emerald ash borer soon. So thank you.